Hello and welcome to Security Scan. I am Uday Bhaskar. Before I introduce my guests, a word about Security Scan. This program seeks to provide an informed and objective perspective on security developments relevant to India, as also those security matters that have a salience both regionally and globally. Today, we look at the complex challenge of India's internal security and more recent events with specific reference to Jammu and Kashmir. The Kashmir Valley has been in a state of considerable animation and anger over the last 6 weeks since the elimination of Burhan Wani, and the security forces have been tested most recently on August 15th, Independence Day, when a senior paramilitary officer was killed. The protests have continued, and the issues we will review on Security Scan are as follows. 1. How do our experts assess the current turbulence in Kashmir, apropos India's internal security and cohesion, and what is the way ahead? To discuss this, we have two eminent experts, Major General Afsir Karim, a distinguished army veteran and editor of Akrosh, one of the first journals in India to focus on low-intensity conflict and terrorism, and Dr. Ajai Sahni, director of the Institute of Conflict Management, which also maintains the South Asia Terrorism Portal, the 2Go website for such matters. But first, a report on the subject.
Ever since the killing of Hizbul militant Burhan Wani on the 8th of July this year, violent protests have unsettled the Himalayan region that split into areas ruled by India and Pakistan. Amid all the unrest, Prime Minister Narendra Modi has maintained a tough line, telling the nation there can't be any compromise on national security.
ये देश हिंसा को कभी सहन नहीं करेगा. ये देश आतंकवाद को कभी नहीं सहन करेगा. ये देश आतंकवाद के सामने कभी झुकेगा नहीं. माओवाद के सामने कभी झुका नहीं.
Addressing the Interstate Council meeting, the Prime Minister told state governments to focus on intelligence sharing that could help the country to stay alert and updated in countering internal security challenges. Also, at an all-party meeting to discuss the current unrest in Kashmir, Modi said the centre was committed to finding a permanent, peaceful solution within the constitution.
कानून व्यवस्था और सुरक्षा बनाए रखना किसी भी सरकार का दायित्व होता है. आतंक की कार्रवाई से समझौता नहीं होगा. दूसरा, आज के युग में लोकतांत्रिक परंपरा के अनुकूल ही सिविल सोसाइटी को नागरिक गतिविधियों से जोड़ते हुए प्रोत्साहित किया जाएगा.
The Prime Minister has clarified there is no laxity in the government's policy on Kashmir. He's asked the External Affairs Ministry to gather information about the pathetic state of affairs of Pakistan-occupied Kashmir from its residents settled abroad and inform the world community about them. Palak Sharma, Rajya Sabha TV.
Let me turn to you, Dr. Sahni. What is your assessment about the situation in Kashmir and India's internal security challenge?
You see, broadly, if you look at the entire spectrum of low-intensity conflicts in India, the insurgent movements in India, we have seen a tremendous decline in intensity, in the number of fatalities and the number of incidents across the board. The Northeast, the Maoist movement and Jammu and Kashmir. In spite of the rather, I would suggest, exaggerated responses to the situation in Jammu and Kashmir, it is important to recognize that there has been a tremendous decline in violence levels. If you take the peak in 2001, we had almost 4,507 fatalities in Jammu and Kashmir related to insurgency. For the period 1990 to 2006, this was a high-intensity conflict. 1,000 plus fatalities. For almost 12 years, 2,000 plus fatalities every year. Last year, we had 174 fatalities. Despite the escalation of the last month and a half, Our total fatalities in Jammu and Kashmir are still below 140. So the problem is that people are trying to evaluate Jammu and Kashmir as some sort of a situation of peace established. That is not the case. This is a state which has been in tremendous turmoil and is now beginning to stabilize. And the levels of violence that we see today are levels of violence that have been contained by these security forces and display a virtual collapse of the insurgency. Because there is an external promoter to this insurgency, some elements continue to disturb the situation. They come across the border, they are resourced from across the border. Even the internal street mobilization is substantially financed and directed from across the border. So to expect this state to abruptly become some kind of an ideal peaceful state
would be
is unrealistic.
invalid. But General Karim, the very fact that we have had an all-party meeting on the subject and the Prime Minister had spoken to parliamentarians, there is a sense that Kashmir is now going through a different kind of dynamic. How would you assess this, considering you've been watching it for more than 25 years?
Firstly, I agree with Sahni that there's a reduction in all kind of incidents across the board. But that's not the only aspect as far as Kashmir is concerned. It's a question of the people. And the main thing is how alienated they are becoming and why. And that is a part of internal security because it is connected with external matters and both violence and otherwise. But it is still not out of control or anything. But looking at the security meeting of all parties, I don't think much came out of it. It just happened. In what policy they're going to adopt really, in what way, is not clear. And in Kashmir, perhaps there's no change seen from the way things are going.
Dr. Sahni, you will recall that when we had NDA 1, Prime Minister Ajai, he had spoken about insaniyat. And concurrently, of course, this goes back to Prime Minister Narasimha Rao, who said that any kind of approach would have to be within the constitution. So now when you review from that period to now, what is it that could be done better or in a more effective way when we look at the politics and the security dynamic?
You see, the idea that anything under the sort of umbrella of insaniyat, of humanity, is acceptable, these are rhetorical postures. They have a significant impact on the ground in terms of perceptions and psyche, but they do not alter the basic equation of power, of the contesting forces that exist on the ground. To address these, we must always, you see, the problem, and what we are talking right now is also in the wake of an ongoing crisis. The problem is we attend to Kashmir and we begin to talk about solutions to Kashmir in periods of crisis and in periods of crisis alone. It is when violence escalates or some major incident occurs that we suddenly say, what should we do with Kashmir? There have been interregnums of at least relative calm. Few incidents do occur, but broadly there is no major terrorist incident, there are no major street mobilization. Odd incidents continue without interruption in Kashmir. That is the condition of the state. But in these periods, these interregnums, what do we do? The entire politics, both in Kashmir and of the center, is a politics of polarization. You are raising issues that not only don't contribute to any kind of solution, but that cannot in fact be addressed at all. This is no time, for instance, to be talking about constitutional amendments, which you simply cannot put through Parliament. You don't have the numbers. This is no time to be talking about pushing the pundits back into the valley. You know you cannot implement these things, but different constituencies, political parties in the valley always adopt a soft separatist line because it addresses their constituency. Center parties, especially the current parties in power, tend to push a Hindutva line because it addresses their constituency. And when this polarization, this orchestrated friction results in mass violence, then suddenly we say, oh, we must look for a solution for Kashmir. And that's the worst time to talk about solutions. The time to talk about solutions is when you have a period of relative calm. You've had elections, you have a certain degree of renewed legitimacy for a new regime. You've got out of the incumbency factor, you've got a new regime. That's a time to address these issues. Unfortunately, we see very little in terms of serious efforts. Well, of course, I would admit, of course, there are all these announcements of packages, but those are not, every prime minister, every government has announced numberless packages. That is not what is winning the confidence of the people. Terminating this friction, this polarized politics, is what is first needed as a condition to go to anything else.
So a return to some kind of normative politics, I don't know if that would be a reasonable
I think that is the essence of it all. That is the essence of it all.
Let me just turn to another matter, General Karim, which is that there is a lot of concern that's been expressed in different quarters about the radicalization in the valley in particular. That while we look at the whole composite state of Jammu and Kashmir and the Kashmir Valley, because of what we have seen in terms of acts of terrorism that we associate with the Islamic State and that particular ideology, again, how would you assess the current orientation as far as the valley is concerned in relation to this particular interpretation of quote-unquote Islam?
You see, I'd say there are two kinds of radicalizations. One is because of our own policies, the way people perceive it and the way they react and how radical they become in various behavior and all kinds of things. Now, the second part is the introduction of Wahhabi culture and religion, which is going on for last 1 year at least in the valley. What I hear that about 900 mosques which were Kashmiri types, their architecture and everything has changed, and their lectures are being given which is totally unacceptable in a composite society. So that is a danger which you are not really addressed, because that has to be addressed at the mosque, at the mohalla and the family level, and also at the social media. I think we have to pay attention to that, because if once that sets in, then there will be no meeting point at all. And presently, it's not gone too far. And this radicalization, other one which I'm talking about, if security policies and political policies are changed in a proper manner, they also go away. So I don't believe that it has gone to a point of no return, but it is advancing rapidly.
Needs the appropriate intervention. But Ajay, this point, this is something again, I think in terms of the discourses and the narratives that we associate with Islam in Kashmir in particular, the Sufi strain and Kashmiriyat, if one could use that in a slightly elastic manner. So far, we have often heard about the political representatives in the state of Jammu and Kashmir, in the valley in particular. We have seen a fair amount of the separatist factions. But what about the spiritual leaders? You know, those who are indigenous to Kashmir and the Sufi, shall we say, mentors. And would they have a role to play, particularly because technology now allows an outreach? You know, for instance, whether you talk about television, social media, is that a strand that could be explored?
You see, theoretically, yes. But you must understand that the constituency of peace has no voice in a situation of widespread conflict. Under the shadow of the gun, it is very, very difficult for people who are pacific in their orientation to speak. Number two, what we are seeing is a combination of very aggressive Wahhabization that General Karim has spoken of, and simultaneously the backup of incidents of intimidation and terrorism. Political intimidation, widespread political intimidation for anyone who tries to revive or speak of Sufi or strains of Islam.
We've seen this for 20 years plus the senior loan, you know.
Exactly. You've seen assassinations, you've seen anyone seeking compromise dies. So I don't think this is a viable alternative unless the state produces an environment where you actually have dialogue and discourse, not intimidation and threats and murder. So in the foreseeable future, I do not see this happening, particularly because, again, what General Karim pointed out, that over the last decade or so, you've had this rise of more than 900 Wahhabist mosques and madrasas. Here I would like to underline one thing. These have not come in spite of the state. They have come in with state facilitation, because the state has been blind to the consequences. They have assumed, because they are particular elements within the state which try to manage terrorism and extremism with a different strand of conservatism or Wahhabization, not realizing that the margins between the two are a hair's breadth. So what has happened is a particular faction, we will not name them here, but a particular faction which was facilitated substantially both by state and central agencies, which receives massive funding from abroad, most of it unaccounted, was encouraged on the grounds that they are against separatism. That particular sect has now split into 4 strands in the valley, and 3 of them are in support of separatism. So unless you actually see what is happening, what are the ideologies that are problematic, and ensure, you cannot go within our constitutional system against the advocacy and propagation of any interpretation of the faith. But you can certainly implement the law of the land as far as the receipt of foreign currencies are concerned. Vast amounts of money flowing into the valley from all sorts of sources to all sorts of individuals and groups.
And again, we presume technology should make it possible to keep racers on
Not only
issues.
that, forget technology. You've got a law of taxation over here. How have you got individuals and institutions with such completely vast amounts of money which cannot be accounted for? I think we don't even need technology. We need old-fashioned taxation or tax laws. And of course, technology also allows you so many instrumentalities to get evidence and prosecute. But we do not have the courage to prosecute anyone in this country who does mischief in the name of religion. As long as you've got religion behind you, any religion, it's not nothing to do with Islam alone, any religion behind you
can be misused
and you have a free license for limitless mischief.
General Karim, in the current sort of template that we are talking about, is there anything more that the security forces should be engaged in? And here when we talk about security forces, I'm talking about the local police, which is the first line, and then we have the paramilitary, and finally, of course, the Indian Army, which is over there. Now, is there a need for a review about the activities and the areas that they are now looking at before we allow the normative politics to really address the situation?
You see, according to me, there's a requirement of a radical change. We were going along with this for a long time, and it has not resulted in anything better than what was happening. You have occupied ground, but you lost the confidence of the people. That's not a policy which is to be followed. Second thing is, as far as army is concerned, is doing its job on the borders mostly, and it should be kept there. The police forces, when you talk of CRPF and all that, they go there untrained, unknowingly what is the customs of that area, what is the language, how to carry on, and they are under pressure all the time. So how do you handle this situation, this up to the force commanders and all that? But it's gone out of hand today, because there's so much of they and us and hatred between them, between the people and these forces, that has to go, otherwise it will continue. Police forces should be reorganized. It is the local police forces, the state police forces should play a major part. After all, whoever is coming out throwing stones is not firing artillery guns.
Seen as a law and order situation.
Yes.
But are we making the right kind of policy initiatives as far as the local police? Ajay, you've written extensively about internal security and the capacity of the state, particularly police and intelligence.
You see, state capacities have enormously been improved, and the state, which was at one point, state forces which were at one time completely paralyzed, have started operating, not in sufficient measure, nor are their capacities and capabilities of the required level. So they are going to continue to need outside forces, and outside forces, as General Karim very rightly points out, are blunt, they are clumsy because of their unfamiliarity, their poor training, their unfamiliarity with customs and populations. So you do need still a very, very large impetus to improve the police capacities. Number two, we have an extremely short-sighted approach to things. They had set up a whole lot of police posts all along the border areas at one point of time when there were high levels of the Jammu and Kashmir police. Once the violence levels in the border areas, in certain border areas, started declining, all those police posts simply became dysfunctional. They were not pulled back, they were not abolished.
They dissolved.
Exactly, they disintegrated, they dissolved. People were pulled out for other duties and they were never posted back. And the entire infrastructure that had been created. So this kind of emergency response orientation that we have, that we are constantly looking at the here and now and not preparing and planning to create a permanent apparatus of security which is adequate to deal with the permanent threats to security. This is what is the balance that is required. Not the problem that we have to confront today, but what are the long-term problems and what is required to meet with those long-term problems.
And get away from the firefighting mode.
And get away from the emergency response or the firefighting mode.
A last issue, General Karim, if I may. This is a contentious kind of a subject that has been discussed not just in relation to J&K but also the Northeast, which is the Armed Forces Special Powers Act. Now, given the current situation in J&K and the response or the perception about this particular Armed Forces Act, how do you think the policymakers should be looking at this?
You see, first thing is this, whatever the act is, it is creating a maximum alienation because of perception, but reality may be something else, but that is the effect. We have to see the effect. As for the army is concerned, well, they gain certain amount of protection against certain things, but there are amendments required, and they have been suggested in Reddy Committee and other ones. I don't know why we are reluctant to apply them in various areas according to the conditions prevailing. That we should do that immediately.
Ajay, you want to comment on this?
You see, the AFSPA is not the problem. The violations that are occurring are not protected by any law. The Reddy Committee that General Karim mentioned had a very, very specious form of reasoning. It said the sentiments, this referred to Manipur particularly, that the sentiments of the people are against AFSPA, which we admit. So AFSPA should be abolished, but its provisions should be brought into the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act. I think this is utterly hypocritical for a judge to have put that down in writing. The problem is not AFSPA. The problem is human rights violations which are ignored or not acted against because of acts of collusion between forces and the people in power. AFSPA does not protect them, and these acts occur in many locations where AFSPA does not apply. The worst state for human rights violations in this country consistently over decades has been Uttar Pradesh, where you've never had AFSPA. So you have to separate AFSPA, which is an enabling act, which is necessary, which may require some modification on the periphery, but it's a very short act. Most people talk about it without reading it. And it does not do anything except give the forces the necessary minimal power that they require to be able to confront an armed
No, I think that's a fair
adversary.
point, that they need that kind of support from the state, as it were. But India's internal security challenges are complex, particularly in relation to Jammu and Kashmir or the Kashmir issue. The external dimension overlaps into the internal, and Pakistan's strategy of investing in terrorism and the tacit support Rawalpindi has received over the years from its principal foreign benefactors has only exacerbated the challenge. India has been dealing with this proxy war since early 1990, and today the dynamic has changed. Hence, it is imperative that this issue receives the kind of empathetic and sustained political attention, normative politics as we said, that it warrants in the months ahead, so that the core national interest is not compromised and the legitimate aspirations of the citizens of Jammu and Kashmir are realized. Concurrently, the role of civil society and the media in creating an enabling ecosystem that assuages the situation and makes it more malleable rather than aggravating it cannot be ignored. On that note, let me thank my guests, Dr. Sahni and General Karim. Thank you for watching Security Scan, and goodbye till next time.